job. Let's speak with Dr. Hannah Quirk, reader in criminal law, King's College London. Hannah, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Nice to have you. Do you know, there's not a day goes past when I don't think about taking a private prosecution out on someone. You know, I think to myself, goodness me, whether it's a parking warden or someone's been a bit mardy in the supermarket, I think if only it was that accessible to me. Now, of course, it is accessible. We live in a democracy. You can take out a private prosecution, but slightly unusual when there's already police action pending, that an individual or an organisation like Reform UK would take this action. But is it doable? Are you allowed to do that?
But it used to be the case that individuals prosecuted crimes privately. So if somebody hit me, then I would bring the prosecution. And for very good reason. That was seen as it didn't protect vulnerable victims in particular. It could be very hard to take action against somebody who had more money than you or was more powerful than you, was your boss, for instance. So the idea now is that prosecutions are generally done by the state. So if you look at any criminal case, it's the Crown against the defendant's name. There is still a power to bring private prosecutions, which is used in some cases. So it can be with specialist prosecutions, so the post office cases, for instance, which is not a great example of private prosecutions, but the post office can prosecute, or any individual can if they wish to do so. But it still has to meet the same tests that the Crown Prosecution Service has to look at, which is there sufficient evidence that there could be a conviction, and is it in the public interest to prosecute?
Where would you send that if I wanted to write my letter for my private prosecution? Who would I be writing to? Presumably not the CPS.
You'd write to the courts to ask them to issue a summons.
Would the courts, in a case such as this, say, thank you very much, Mr. Collins, for your letter. However, there's already a legal process going on in this particular instance, so your private prosecution would have to wait until we see the outcome of that. Would one usurp the other, or can they run in parallel?
Yeah, so they can notify the Crown Prosecution Service that a private prosecution has been launched, and the Crown Prosecution Service can take over that prosecution. So either they take it forward themselves, or, as seems more likely if they've already said, that they could stop the prosecution going ahead. Yeah.
I mean, this particular case, I mean, it's curious, isn't it? Because you couldn't have put it in a Netflix documentary that we got this footage that looked horrendous, and pretty much everybody agreed, my goodness, you know, that's not really the way we want to see policing done in this country. And then a few hours or days later, whatever it was now, we then saw something else. And it's the classic thing. You've been in enough courtrooms to know that, you know, I remember the first time going to a big case as a journalist and listening to a defence barrister stand up, and I thought, well, the prosecutor might not bother to turn up, frankly, because the case is clearly, it's done and dusted. There it is. And we all go for lunch and come back and you go, wow, there is another version of events after all, which is the beauty of law, of course, that, you know, we examine all of these things. But nonetheless, I mean, it's a curious position we've arrived in, and it sounds as if, and I appreciate this is sort of slightly outside the realms of our initial conversation, but just from a legal brain perspective here, does it sound to you as if two different authorities, CPS, IOPC, are kind of waiting to sort of act in unison on this one?
I would be surprised. The IOPC investigations normally follow a criminal decision. So, for instance, the officer in the Chris Carver case, the IOPC will look at that now that the criminal proceedings are concluded, partly because they work to different standards of proof and because they're trying to do different things. So normally the criminal decision would be taken first. Yeah. I think
presumably both of these, the assault element, should we call it that, both of those are with the CPS, right? I mean, there's two things they'd be looking at.
Yes. So they will look at, first of all, whether a crime has been committed, and then also whether there's a defence to that crime. Yeah. So if somebody attacks me and I punch or stab them in order to protect myself, that's not a crime, because even though I have punched or stabbed them, which normally would be a crime, I've got a complete defence of self-defence. Yeah, so that's clearly an issue in this case, whether they're looking at either party as arguing self-defence. It's a really good example of why people shouldn't comment on cases without having seen all the evidence. As you said, these things do come out, and the investigating authorities in this case will look at, they'll get witness statements, they'll get different CCTV, a short clip on social media is not the way to decide these things.
I totally agree.
Political parties should not be getting involved in this. It's really dangerous to politicise these kind of very controversial cases.
Yeah, and I tend to, I know that there's, a lot of people say, look, reform are speaking our language. There's a lot of frustration. I get that, but we, law is, courts and the like divorce sentiment in these cases, and there's a good reason for that, of course. And, we'd be prosecuting people left, right and centre otherwise. Yes, indeed.
Yes. So they hear the dog whistle and the two-tier policing and that kind of allegation sticks, and that can feed into, as we saw in the summer, quite serious social disorder. It
is fair to say that it is unusual, though, right? It's kind of interesting that, even if, I'm sure there's a load of CPS lawyers who eventually will say, this is why it took so long that we had to go through this process, and then what you don't know is this happened, and you don't know that that happened, and there's also another case that's nothing to do with this but is relevant to this. There could be all of those factors at play here, which are often really crucial.
And also they're massively overworked and very underfunded.
That's very true. But it is nonetheless, on the face of it, it's quite unusual to take this long. Would that be fair?
I'm not sure it would be. I mean, it's obviously a contentious case, but it's perhaps not the most pressing if you haven't got suspects in custody. So where you've got the suspects remanded in custody, then obviously decisions have to be taken more quickly. Sorry, that's a charging decision. But there may well be a lot to look at. There may be witnesses who aren't in the country. There may be witnesses who don't speak fluent English, so you need translators. You may have children around, so you'd need specially trained investigators to talk to them. There might be difficulties getting the CCTV from different companies who hold the material. It is a hugely laborious process, but you want them to do it properly, because it would be worse if they rush to a decision and then the case either falls apart or somebody's charged who shouldn't be. So again, I think it's very inappropriate for politicians to be getting involved in this.
There it is. Hannah, thank you for your time. Very thorough stuff. Thank you, Dr. Hannah Quirk, reader in criminal law, King's College London.